Hi guys, in this video I'm going to talk about economic growth. Remember that I recorded separate videos on how you can calculate labor productivity, how you can calculate economic growth rate, and there was also one more thing. Let me just check. Um, I also have a video on application of rule of 70. So let me go back in here. All right. Um, in this chapter, basically, we want to um, talk about economic growth. If you remember in chapter one, we talked about PPC, production possibilities frontier or production possibilities curve. And if you remember, after defining PPC and looking at different characteristics of PPC, we talked about um, basically shifting PPC outward. Okay. If you remember, there were a couple reasons that we could actually shift our PPC outward and produce more goods and services. One of them was improvement in technology, the other one was increase in the amount of resources, factors of production, we called them in chapter one. Another reason was when we improved the quality of our resources. These were the three main reasons for shifting our PPC outward. Okay, that's the simplest way of defining also economic growth. So economic growth is nothing but the expansion of a PPC, okay, that we had in chapter one. But if you want to have a more kind of standard definition for economic growth, that's the definition that I put here for you. We have two important definitions in the second and third paragraph. So the first one is the increase in real GDP. We learned how to calculate real GDP in previous chapter. We know that real GDP was different from nominal GDP. If you remember, real GDP basically tries to deal with the impact of inflation, and we're just trying to capture the actual amount of production and the changes in the production over time. Um, and that's why even for economic growth, we use real GDP, because if you remember, we also talked about using real GDP as the better kind of way of measuring a standard of living in chapter 7. Okay, it's the same thing also here. And if we want even to be more precise in defining our economic growth rate, it's better if you look at the increase in the real GDP per capita, okay, or per person over time when we define economic growth. What is your share from the real GDP? Because if you remember, real GDP measures the income, right? The income of a country. So another or the better way of measuring economic growth is to measure individual share from the total real GDP or the total income of a country or the total amount of production. These were the things that GDP can measure, if you remember from chapter 7. If you don't, I definitely recommend you guys to go back to chapter 7, read again how we defined GDP, read how we define real GDP and how we calculated real GDP in chapter 7. Okay. And real GDP per capita is this is the formula that I put here, is the real GDP divided by population. So we call it real GDP per capita or real GDP per person. Both of them are the exact same thing. So economic growth, and I like actually the last definition because it's more precise. So economic growth is an increase in either real GDP or real GDP per capita. Okay. So um and that's a little data I put here for you. So we want to now learn how to calculate the economic growth rate. Okay, the economic growth rate is basically the percentage change in real GDP um, over time. Okay, and we have a formula here. Remember, for the test, you can have your formula in front of you, no problem, but just make sure you know how to use them. Okay. And this is the formula we have. It's the real GDP in the current year minus real GDP of the previous year. So that's the change in real GDP, right? Divided by the real GDP in the previous year. And since it's a percentage change in real GDP, you have to multiply this ratio by 100. And I put a little example for you here. Definitely watch the video that I have on calculating real GDP. sorry, the growth rate of real GDP and the growth rate of real GDP per capita, okay? If the question asking for the real GDP, growth rate of real GDP or economic growth rate, this is the formula you are going to use. You are going to, let's say you want to calculate the real GDP in 2020. So your current year will be 2020, your previous year will be 2019, and at the denominator, again, you're dividing the whole thing but this change in real GDP by the real GDP in 2019. And then you can multiply it by 100, then you can have your economic growth rate or the growth rate of real GDP in 2020. But as I said, it is better actually if we look at the increase in real GDP per capita over time. So in order to calculate the growth rate of real GDP per capita, the very first step you need to take is to measure your real GDP per capita. And that's easy if you have the real GDP and if you have the population. This is the formula you are going to use. Divide your real GDP by population, you can get the real GDP per capita. The formula for growth rate of real GDP per capita is very, very similar to this formula we already had. Instead of real GDP, you have to put real GDP per capita in the current year minus real GDP per capita in the previous year divided by real GDP per capita in the previous year. And again, you're going to multiply it by 100. So let me show you the formula. This is the, oops. This is the formula. So I wrote it in the video that I had, like the whole thing. But let me just, this is just a numeric example. So let me just add a few things here. Come on. Okay, let me get my board here. And so growth rate of real GDP per capita. So this first number here is real GDP, GDP, that's per capita, okay, of the current year, per capita, capita of this year. Oh my gosh, so hard to write. Of this year or current year, okay? And then the second number in this ratio at top is the real GDP. If you watch that video that I'm talking about, it's the best way for me. I wrote it actually better, and probably that's the better uh, way of looking at numbers and formula if you watch the other one. That is the real GDP per capita, of the previous year, okay? Current minus previous. And again, you're going to divide it by previous. Okay, I'm not going to write it again for the denominator, but again, this 40,000 is again the real GDP per capita in the previous year, okay? So that's one way of writing the growth rate of real GDP per capita, growth rate of real GDP per capita. Another way of calculating it is using the second formula. So for the economic growth or the growth rate of real GDP, we only have one formula, real GDP of the current year minus real GDP of previous year divided by real GDP in the previous year, right? For growth rate of real GDP per person, you can either use this formula, real GDP per capita of the current year minus real GDP per capita of the previous year divided by real GDP per capita of the previous year. Another way, so this is formula number one for growth rate of real GDP per person or real GDP per capita, okay? We also have another formula, which is when you calculate economic growth rate or the real GDP or the growth rate of real GDP, and then you can calculate population growth. So this is the second formula. And then you can subtract basically the growth rate of population or your population growth rate from the growth rate of real GDP per capita. Both formula number one and number two will give you the exact same number. And this is the formula. Again, I have it in my separate video. This is the formula for growth rate of population. Again, this is the percentage change in population from one year to another. So for the growth rate of population, that is a population pop in the current year, current, okay, current for this year, current, the $200 million is population in the previous year. Again, at the bottom of the ratio, you again have the population in the previous year. Okay. And since it's a percentage change, you are going to multiply it by 100. So first you calculate the growth rate of real GDP using the very first formula we had. Then you have to calculate the population growth rate, and you are going to use this formula, and then you will get the exact same number. So two different ways of calculating growth rate um, of real GDP per capita. Both of them will give you the exact same thing. Okay. Another concept we have when it comes to economic growth is this rule of 70. Again, I have a separate video talking about it and telling you how you can use the formula and calculate it, but just briefly remember that the rule of 70 is a kind of an easy way for economists and politicians to predict how many years it will take for a country to double the current economic growth rate. You can use this rule of 70 for any economic variable, but since this chapter is about economic growth, we are interested in basically using this formula to measure and predict and estimate the number of years it will take for a country to double the current economic growth rate. And I give you an example here, but I also, again, calculated the number of years we're estimating in that video. So for United States, if the current economic growth rate is 2%, if you use the rule of 70, it will take 35 years for United States to double this 2%, which it will take 35 years for United States to end up with a 4% economic growth rate. And for China, it will take only 10 years if their current economic growth rate is 7%. So again, this is not 100% accurate, but it is kind of an estimate, and it will allows basically economies and politicians to know how much they should invest in the economy if they're interested in um, increasing the economic growth rate over time and in the future. Okay. Another important concept that we have in this chapter is economic development. And remember that the economic development is different from economic growth. Economic growth is all about this increase in real GDP. Economic development is more than increase in real GDP. Of course, it kind of includes the economic growth, but it's beyond just the real GDP and numbers. It's also about the quality of, let's say, institution in a country, access to clean water, quality of education in a country, transparency in the government in a country. These are different ways that we can measure economic development. For instance, if you look at these two numbers here, for these two countries, for Sri Lanka and Brazil, and this is a real GDP per capita, you really cannot tell what's going on in these two countries. You cannot really tell which country is doing better because you need to know about economic development in these two countries. Okay, you can have a country with higher real GDP per capita, but at the same time, that country might not be as developed as another country with lower real GDP per capita. In terms of economic growth, by looking at these two numbers, you can tell, yes, Brazil has higher real GDP per capita, so economic growth rate should be higher in Brazil. Of course, we need to also have the data for the previous year, right, to kind of measure that economic growth. But at the same time, these two numbers cannot tell you which country is more developed. Okay, you cannot really tell about economic development in these two countries unless you have other economic development indicators that we have, and then look at all those indicators, and then you can have a better understanding about what's going on in these two countries and which country is better off, is enjoying a higher standard of living, and so forth. I don't want to spend that much time talking about economic development. If you are an econ major, you will definitely learn more. You will have a separate course, economic development, so you will learn more about it. But I just wanted to clarify between economic development and economic growth, because even politicians sometimes make this mistake and use these two terminologies, I would say, not correctly. So I just wanted to clarify that economic development is beyond economic growth, and they are not exactly the same thing. Okay. Um, these are the things that you can also study at home, different classifications of developed and developing countries. We have UN, which is more common, and we have World Bank classification here. I just want to raise one thing here. And I still see even the politicians use this type of language. We really do not use the first world, third world anymore. If we want to refer a country which is poor, and it's in the low income basically category, we use these terminologies like least developed countries, low income countries. Okay. um, we really don't say that country is a third world country. We really do not use this language nowadays. Okay, but again, many even politicians use this type of still classification. These are kind of old school, but nowadays economists try to use these type of classification by UN or World Bank. Okay, and if you are interested, you can learn more. I put some information for you how you can basically categorize how World Bank is defining, let's say, low income, middle income, and so forth. I'm not going to ask anything on the test. Okay, I just wanted you to know about economic development and also these type of classification, and just kind of um, raise this issue that don't use this language of first world, third world. We don't use it anymore in econ. Um, what else? Okay, another important thing in here, that again, I just want you guys to kind of know about, is that for um, more advanced countries like United States, Canada, Japan, the reasonable economic growth rate, or the annual economic growth rate, is between 2 to 3%. If you can achieve that economic growth rate, we're good to go. And it's really hard to have higher economic growth rate for especially advanced countries. It will take a lot of time for countries to achieve this economic growth rate. And most countries, especially lower income countries or developing countries, they have lots of potential to increase their economic growth rate over time. And at the beginning, since the capital accumulation in these countries is pretty low, the rate of economic growth rate is pretty high. But when they reach one, it's around like 7%, 8% economic growth rate, the economic growth rate will slow down eventually, because capital accumulation is enough in a country. That country has enough capital to invest and produce different goods and services to achieve industrialization. That migration from, let's say, rural to urban area will be completed. We will see more industrialization industrialized goods and services that are produced in a country compared to agricultural products. These are the process that basically countries who are experiencing fast economic growth are going to experience. And that capital accumulation that I was talking about is going to happen during this time when the industrialization is happening. So at the beginning, low income countries, they can achieve very high economic growth rate because of these changes that are happening. But at some point they are going to slow down, okay? And when they become actually and basically jump from low income to middle income, and from middle income country to a rich country or high level income countries, their economic growth rate will be between 2 to 3%, which is a reasonable number even for us in United States. um, because we're just going to basically maintain these 2%, 3% economic growth rate by investing a lot in technology and R&D, research and development, okay? Because again, that process of industrialization is already completed. So 2%, 3% is still huge with the amount of capital we have in our country, if that makes sense. Let me drink some water. Um, and this is exactly what's happening in China. Um, in China, the economic growth rate was very high. Of course, it's kind of like an exception because we saw this high economic growth rate in China for a very long time. That kind of um, that was kind of, as I said, exceptional and kind of an outliner in terms of many economic theories. Um, but we are seeing actually economic growth rate, even in China, is kind of slowing down because of COVID. Of course, economic growth rate of all countries um, is kind of going down. It went down, especially last year. They're catching up this year. But even without COVID, China was experiencing that kind of slower economic growth rate over time. Um, but it's happening. It's happening even in China. Okay. So reasonable economic growth rate for advanced countries is between 2 and 3, and it's not really low. You might think it's low, but it's really hard even to achieve that with the amount of capital and real GDP we have. Okay. Another thing that another kind of topic that we can look into briefly in this chapter is about rich countries and poor countries. Remember that it is possible, as I mentioned, for poor countries or low income countries to kind of grow over time. And we call them sometimes follower countries. The best way for them to kind of grow and start that process of industrialization and capital accumulation is to adopt technology from rich countries or leader countries. And remember, for leader countries with 2 to 3% economic growth rate, they are heavily invested in technology and R&D. So they are the ones who come up with all the new technologies, and they have, because they have, obviously they have resources. And for the followers, the easiest way to grow is to adapt those technologies. But of course, here is a catch. This is just a theory, but let me just tell you the reality. Many of these follower countries cannot even adapt the technology, unfortunately. We're saying in theory that it's easy. If they adapt them, they can grow because they have the potential, they have low level of capital. But if people are not educated in these countries, if they're not experienced, even if you give them the latest technologies, if they don't know how to use it, there's no way for them to use the technology and produce more goods and services and start that process of industrialization and the capital accumulation. So it's not going to happen. And that's, in my opinion, one of the reasons that we still have rich countries, poor countries, because they are the basis of um, economic development actually does not exist in these countries, which one of them is education and um, government. There's lots of problem with their government, transparency in their government. we see corruption in most of these countries. So even if resources comes from rich countries, technology even comes to that country, because of the corruption in these countries, they cannot really take the advantage of even latest technologies. Um, and use them to kind of start even this process of economic growth. They have lots of problems with their healthcare system. So the quality of healthcare system is pretty bad and low. And if the life expectancy in a country is low, if you have lots of sick people, especially in the labor market, obviously you do not have a healthy labor, you do not have an educated labor, so this process of growth will not be that easy. So this catching up process that even put it here that is possible, in reality is not possible. So this is economic theory, and I told you the real kind of side of the story. Okay. So these are the preconditions of growth, and these are the things, excuse me, that you need to basically have in a country to give them that technology to start with. Okay, so these are the preconditions of growth. You need to have strong property rights. You need to have, as I said, um, a government with that can basically that is just transparent. Okay, you need to reduce the level of corruption in a country. You need to come up with good financial institutions, otherwise people won't be interested in investing in these countries. Give them money, invest them. It's important to invest in education, open up the country and have trade with other countries, remove some of the barriers of trade. You need to provide competitive market. We talked about different economic systems, if you remember in chapter 2. Remember, we had market economy, we had laissez-faire capitalism. So we need to move toward that um, competitive market system. Okay, so these are some of them. They're not even all. Some of the conditions that we need to start that process of modern economic growth. Okay, um, we need to be focused on the factors that can improve economic growth, or the determinants of growth. Oh, it's up here. Determinants of growth, there are demand factors and there are supply factors. These are the demand factors that are basically the components of GDP we had in chapter 7: household, businesses, government, and also you have relationship with other countries. And these are the supply factors, like the natural resources we also had in chapter 1 when we talked about PPC, that we should increase the quality of your resources as well as the quantity of your resources. You need to have more qualified and skilled labor. You need to increase the amount of capital. You need to provide and increase the capital per person, per labor, provide more capital for all the workers. You need to improve the technology. You need to um, invest much more in education of your labor. Okay, so these are the supply factors that we have. And then we have labor productivity, which is related to the supply factors. And if you took micro, we also had productivity in microeconomics. But here is the definition of labor productivity. And as I mentioned, I have a separate video recorded, basically teaching you how, showing you how you can calculate labor productivity. But labor productivity is the amount of output per unit of input. Here, we're talking about labor as an important input or factor of production we have. So labor productivity is the quantity of our output, or the amount of output produced by our labor. 1 hour of labor. That's kind of the way that we define our labor here, okay? And since we're talking about macroeconomics, that output is our real GDP. The formula is here. So again, um, watch that video to learn, but it's really easy. Just remember the formula, and I can ask you to calculate labor productivity, or I can give you the labor productivity in the hours of work, and then ask you how to, then I can ask you to calculate real GDP. So we'll learn how to calculate real GDP in chapter 7. But if you are taking notes, especially of the formulas we have, you can also have this formula. So you can use the traditional method calculating real GDP as we did in chapter 7, or you can use the real labor productivity to calculate real GDP. So if you multiply the real GDP by, if you multiply the labor productivity by the hours of work, you can get your labor, oh my gosh, I'm tired. You can get your real GDP, okay? So that's a formula for real GDP and labor productivity. And that's just an example, right? That's pretty much it. If you look at the lecture notes, I also put some stuff about different um, growth theories. I'm not going to ask anything. It's just for your information to read. There won't be any question on the test from different economic growth theories. Again, if you are an econ major, you will learn more about them in more detail. You will have some sort of math models for them, but not here for our class, okay? I hope that you um, found this video helpful. I'm just going to show you. I'm not going to ask anything on anti-growth view or other economic growth theories. That's the only thing you need to know for this chapter. Next time.